Hi, I'm Brad, and today I'm going to be talking about not just this thing, but all of these things and more. It's no secret to anyone who's been watching me for a while that I enjoy the Lighthouse tracking system. I get why people don't like it, it's not very convenient to hang up base stations and all these things. But for me, it's just a system that has kind of just worked and at a very high performance level. However, I've been seeing a lot of interesting things related to digging into some patents and data mining stuff to see where Valve is heading for their sort of future tracking systems. Will they keep allowing people to use base stations? Are they working on new technologies to get rid of them? What are they doing? And more recently, I started seeing them fleshing out a different system, at least internally for prototyping, that got me to really appreciate this sort of system even more and made me want to dive deeper into how it works and give sort of a baseline of the history of how Valve does these things and sort of what they came to and how exactly these things work into a sort of a detailed yet layman's terms sort of way so you can appreciate if you bought these things or haven't, like what is the magic going on there. So the idea in this video is to talk about the early prototypes, which I have. I mean, these are all early prototypes that I have as well, whether they be from dev kits or internal Valve things or whatever. I have kind of an addiction with finding these and collecting them based on whether they pop up on Goodwill or eBay. I nab them. And then we're going to make our way to the present, which is obviously the 2.0s and why this was a sort of bigger iteration over everything else and kind of talk about some sort of other ways that Valve might be going for photodiode-based tracking in the future. So yeah, this video is going to be a mess. Obviously, anything with the future is more speculative because until there's an actual product announcement, we cannot say for sure that is what they're going for. But again, this is all data based on research I've been doing, based on patents that they seem to be fleshing out, and more team members are coming together. So it's important to start with the beginnings. So Valve had a hardware team since around 2012. A little bit actually before that is where they started getting serious. They didn't know if they were going to get into AR or VR. There were some teams that wanted to get into AR. They were laid off because they just wouldn't stop getting into AR. A lot of people at Valve felt that AR was too difficult, so they should all focus their energy on VR. That's a whole other story for a whole other day, but it's an interesting thing. And when they started exploring VR, they realized why VR didn't shoot or take off in the early periods, such as the 90s, where there was also a big sort of VR rush to try to get the consumer market able to immerse themselves in sort of very pixelated voxel type environments. And they realized it wasn't really just the graphics rendering or all the other stuff. There was a lot of things they had to figure out. And Valve realized that tracking is probably the most important thing more than anything else that they really had to nail if they wanted users to not get sick or really enjoy being in a virtual environment. So the way that the Valve prototypes teams would go to work is they would do all these different tests, and I wouldn't say compete with each other, but they would have sort of different people kind of buying stuff off eBay, all these off-the-shelf parts, and just makeshifting stuff with 3D printers, basic breadboards. Now, during all these sort of competing different hardware tracking systems, a man named Alan Yates, who still works at Valve to this day, by the way, came up with a early prototype of what he called the Lighthouse system. And while everyone was kind of sharing their different ideas and everything, the idea from going from prototype to mass consumer is always very difficult. And Alan actually had the most scalable concept because the Lighthouse system was very promising, and they realized that they were able to more easily track multiple options or multiple devices better than the other ones could. A lot of them could do some really high quality stuff, but either they would be too expensive to mass produce, or they just could have issues with tracking controllers as well as the HMD. So all their work eventually would lead to one of the more first prototypes, and this is not the first, but it's one of the more earlier ones, and this one's called Batman. It's very large and it's extremely heavy because there's tons of metal pieces. There's still a lot of glass and heavy. It's giant, and hopefully it turns on. Not turning on. To be honest, I got scared for a little bit because this thing was not turning on, and I had to keep unplugging and plugging it back in. But yes, Batman. It's very loud, very large, and kind of gave the first basis for what all the other versions afterwards would kind of set in motion. And really, the Lighthouse space station kind of has three main components, I would say. You can see these little spinning rotors here. These were basically started out as hard drive spinners, and they pretty much run at 5400 RPM, just like the old hard drives, and that would make them last about as long as a normal hard drive would back in the day. So I'm going to pull up the next prototype that they would iterate on next, and this is the Robin prototype, which is a lot more clear and transparent, so it's easier to talk about. So yes, they definitely miniaturized it a bit more, but they still kept the two rotors. And these two rotors, the way the rotors work is they have basically an IR light being focused into a laser beam for each rotor. And then it will reflect off a mirror and you can see there's a lens right here in the rotor. That lens is just purely to fan it into a straight line. And as the rotors spin, that is how it broadcasts a line of infrared light that you can't actually see with your eyes across your room. So that laser would then reach a headset or a peripheral that is covered with these pretty fairly simple photodiodes. Now you can see they're if you have a Vive or a Valve Index, these photodiodes have actually not changed nearly at all since the first generation Vive dev kit I have here from 2015. The Valve Index uses the same ones, and all they do is they convert that light energy like a solar cell into an electric charge that can say, hey, we were hit by this bit of light. So when that happens, the laser sweep I talked about earlier will go like this and this. For each laser sweep, depending on how slow or fast that it goes across your headset, it can convert that time into how far time the light actually reaches your headset photodiode and how long it sweeps across the headset, exactly how far the base station is from the HMD or peripheral. And there's a little chips inside that are attached to the photodiode that convert not only just the laser light being saying that it got hit, but they also encode a little bit of data into that laser, kind of similar to how they can convert sort of signal like music or things onto the AM radio. Very similar, but instead of like radio waves, they're using actual light. With the first generation and the early generation base stations, they didn't encode too many things because they relied on this thing here. Now you can see both, well, I should say every unit pretty much had these. These are what they call the sync pulse or the sync blaster. It's just a bunch of IR LEDs that they charge up. Every time that one rotor spins, it charge up and blast light into the room, and it actually resets every single one of these photocells to say, hey, start counting until you get the next laser sweep. So that's how they can decide, oh, well, that sweep is done. Okay, well, let's wait for the next one. And then they calculate the time and convert that data into a very small stream and then send that to the headset's FPGA chip, which converts all that data into a tracking system and then goes into your PC. So it technically is an inside-out tracking because these are basically just dummy emitters with a little bit of tricks going on in there. And the headset does the actual computations on board itself. Now, there was a lot of limits with the 1.0 base station when it first sort of got into a serious mode, especially around this time is probably when it was getting more serious. And because you required two base stations to have a full 360 room scale view, the lighthouses actually had to sync and spin at the same exact time. The best way that they sort of did this early on is they actually used a synchronized cable that would go all the way across your room from one base station to the other, which was very not ideal. It was really bad. I remember the early versions of the Vive even included this cable. It was a terrible idea just to have a cable going across your room, especially when you're doing VR. So they figured out one way to sort of fix this, and of course, like everything else, it was to put a photodiode in the base station. So not only was the headset photodiodes able to see the giant IR blast from this here, but the base stations were able to see it as well. Because this, again, only blasts when the rotors reach a certain rotation. And that is how the first base station would see the other one, see where it's at, and then sync it up to also do the same sort of scan line, exactly the same speed, exactly the same timing as the other one. So they were able to remove the sync cable, which was probably would be a bigger barrier of adoption for the consumer VR back in 2016 if they did not do that. Now, there were more problems with the 1.0 system, and that had a lot to do, again, with this sync blaster here. So the actual lasers could actually travel a pretty far distance and were pretty scalable in terms of making the area bigger. But you could only have two of these things in one space, and really just one headset to begin with. There was only 3 channels you can set them to, and they really were only designed to work with 2 base stations. The reason this is again, even though the lasers can spread far, this has quite a bit of a limit of how far the light on these lenticulars can travel. And I say lenticulars because you can see they even tried to expand that sort of distance the light can travel to reset all the photodiodes by putting these special lenses on top of it. The earlier versions did not have that, as you can see, so it's a little clever idea to use optics, which they're probably learning from all their optics work with Fresnel and Aspheric and Pancake during their R&D time to bring it to the base station. So they realized, okay, we have a really high accuracy system, we can encode data into the laser beams. Why can't we take that a step further and somehow get rid of the main cause of why we're so limited to how many base stations people can use, how big an area can be, whether we can go past the main extended area. And that's what they basically would do with 2.0. Now, it's very important to say that there isn't just photodiodes going on here. The photodiodes are really connected to a signal in an IC provided from a company called Triad Semiconductor, and they would do a lot of the analog to digital encoding, because the lasers would, again, send out a signal, give out some very basic information, and the Triad Semiconductor chips, ICs, would have to translate that into data to the headset for it to triangulate everything. Now, they took that a step further with 2.0. They finally got rid of this giant sync blaster here, and the reason they were able to do that is instead of just relying on the actual photodiodes to be reset, they encoded more information about the base station, things such as its channel, its angle, all these different things into the laser to give more data and send it over the laser beams. Not only that, they actually removed one of these rotors here, and instead of having one laser going into one rotor, they actually had one laser and they would split into 2 beams with one wheel, but they would go in a diagonal form. And both those diagonals, again, would have data transcoded into it to completely remove all of this stuff. And this is what allowed these things to exist. They gave a bit of wider field of view, a larger range with 2 base stations automatically, because again, the limiting factor for how big a space could be was this lenticular IR LEDs. And not only that, they realized that since they don't need to see each other, base stations no longer have to see each other to sync. You can just have a bunch of these things all over across different rooms. If you have an arcade or something, you can have more than 4, and you can switch into different spaces, go across different rooms if you have 2 in each room or 4 kind of connected within each other. And that's it's very highly scalable, is what I'll say. I did some experiments in my own room by using like a 10-meter extension cable for the big screen beyond. And even though I didn't have as many lighthouses to do it, it definitely works if you had a very good setup, and I've seen many people do it before, and it's kind of a neat little experiment. Of course, people still complain that they have to hang these things up, and while there's a lot of benefits to having these emitters, such as all the cool accessories people have made, such as full body trackers, such as the Tundra trackers or the HTC Vive trackers, and cool little things like that, people are obsessed with the idea that we need stuff that isn't required to hang stuff up. So now let's talk about the future. Where is Valve looking today? I've talked a little bit about some of the interesting systems that they've been working on. They've been working on camera vision stuff with a company called Arcturus Industries, and I do think they'll incorporate some of that stuff in their headset. But I'm getting more in this idea, and based on some sort of data mining stuff and connections to some patents, which are again, more people are coming on board, including people who usually work on firmware, and people who are usually working on controllers for VR. They're all being credited as inventors as this patent grows and gets updated. And they're even talking about stuff like power saving features or making sure IR LEDs can change the brightness depending on the ambient light level of your room, which is not really stuff you do when you're just throwing stuff against the wall when prototyping. It seems like Valve is fleshing out this one system I'm about to talk about. So I ordered a couple of photodiodes here. One is very similar to the basic single cell photodiodes you have in the Valve Index and older, but there's another one here that is actually very different and is being credited as the main sort of benefit to what they want to do in the future in case if they want to go for a photodiode based tracking system. And what I'm holding in my hand, even though you can't really see it, this is what they call a quad photodiode, a quad cell. Instead of having just one active area that turns on or off, or at least receives data on or off, there is four, two X and two Y quadrants. And by doing this, they call them angle sensitive detectors because not only can light transmit data to these photodiodes similar to the old lighthouse, but these little photodiodes can also, based on the X and Y values, be able to calculate the angle that the light is coming from. So this is pretty interesting because if a user doesn't really want base stations, they give a lot of examples in the patents that they would be able to sort of mock up a controller full of IR LEDs, and the actual photodiodes would be able to see the angle of which every photodiode or IR LED transmits lights to the photodiode on the headset. Now, the problem is normally doing something like that is very difficult because you have a bunch of IR LEDs and then you can't really tell each one. Some ways that they would get past this is by changing the IR LED blinking sequence, but there's a better technology that they've been really serious about for quite a few years in terms of a lot of their technologies they're doing R&D on, and that is the use of polarization. Valve has been very interested in messing with polarization for a variety of different ways. They invested early on in 2018 to a company called ImagineOptix, and they would later sue that company because I think it was getting acquired by Meta and some of the investments that they were putting into this company, which was all focused on polarization, liquid crystal optics, all these different layers and thin films to allow them to do better optics for VR or better tracking systems. A lot of interesting stuff. And after they dropped their lawsuit against ImagineOptix, and before it was eventually acquired by Meta, they filed a bunch of patents of a ton of different things related to what they call spatially varying polarizers. Just a lot of fancy polarizers doing different things. And every single technology, whether it be eye tracking or optics for your eyes or tracking, they would be using the idea of changing the polarization of light, whether it be infrared or whatever wavelength, to better every system they're working on. And that includes this tracking system. So not only would they be able to change the IR LED sequence, but they would be able to put different polarizers onto each IR LED and each photodiodes. So if, for example, you have one type of polarization for an IR LED and that same polarization for that photodiode would only be able to see that IR LED with the same polarized state. And that would allow them to filter out that data better, be able to know which sort of IR LED is on a controller or a base station, for example, if they wanted to go with a 3.0 base station, and be able to mark that as the angle of light is coming from this diode, is at this sequence, the sequence of light might be transmitting data based on that. And a lot of their system is based on that concept. So you would have this mishmash of sort of this camera-based inside-out tracking and Lighthouse with an option of also using base stations, because the patent also does still refer to the idea of using rotor-based base stations to transmit IR LEDs, because it's very likely that these quad cell photodiodes could still be sort of acting as a single cell to give some sort of backwards compatibility with older versions of Lighthouse, just like 2.0 did with 1.0 base stations. By the way, if you're ever wondering why 1.0 products such as this do not work with 2.0 base stations, it's because these things, the ICs that are connected to these photodiodes, they're constantly waiting for a sync pulse that no longer exists in the 2.0 base stations. So that is why those don't work. They would basically be counting forever and not be able to reset themselves to give a position. So what about camera tracking? They are working with Arcturus Vision. They are doing stuff with cameras. They have a lot of references to pass-through AR in SteamVR data mines. What would Valve do? Why would they have photodiodes and cameras at the same time? Because I still think photodiodes, especially with Valve, they're pretty obsessed with that technology. They've gotten very good at using them and triangling positions of different things. And photodiodes are low power. You can spread them all over a headset at a very low cost because they're much cheaper than cameras, and they have a higher refresh rate for tracking, which again, Valve valued tracking very highly in the early days. So people have a one-to-one feeling. They don't get motion sick. They feel like they're in the world and they feel very immersed. But at the same time, even with the Valve Index, they did put cameras, stereo cameras in it. And while it wasn't used much, Arcturus Vision has shown a lot of amazing sort of experiments and demos, including using SLAM tracking and controller tracking with those cameras, which are full color cameras that have global shutters. They're not really designed for SLAM tracking that much, but due to the fact that these people working at Arcturus are very good at their job, there's been some amazing stuff being shown off and by the community as well. Like Rectus is doing a whole OpenXR pass-through layer to allow AR games to work with SteamVR. And there's a lot of stuff happening there. So I do think that we'll be able to have both in one system. I would be very shocked if it wasn't very similar to the Valve Index in terms of photodiode and stereo camera setup. I think that would be very likely. And yeah, that's pretty much what I've been researching and been watching and what I believe will happen with the next headset. I still could be wrong, but a lot of these things I've just been watching over the past few years and trying to figure out what Valve is doing for tracking, it all kind of connects with the data mines and the patents. So I do believe what I said here is as true as I can get it. Anyway, I know that was a long-winded video and I kind of just rambled about the different technologies, but there was a lot of information and this is a lot coming from my brain. It was a very fun video to research and I haven't been doing too many videos because it's hard to do videos that you really are passionate about. And this was a video I was pretty passionate about. So I hope people enjoyed it and maybe can appreciate how these things work, but maybe you've had them on your walls and you just looked at them and are like, what is that thing? Well, hopefully you have a better idea what it is and how it works, because it's pretty freaking cool. Laser beams. Special thanks to all my Patreons that also, especially my mega patrons listed here that support me and allow me to do videos like this. Hopefully we'll have some really cool content coming soon. I've been working a lot in VR actually. Almost every time I'm on Twitter or doing stuff related to doing research on the internet, I love hopping into VR chat with a comfortable headset, high resolution, and just browse the internet in an overlay. And I've been figuring out a lot of different ways of how I can better that experience. And just to give a hint for whenever that video comes out, trackballs are cool. Bye.